Ginawa na kaming branch dyan sa dati.
Then you're looking for your watch.
Capture mo yung
Really?
originality ng
You like?
location.
So I have an
Yeah.
I'm going to slow.
Actually, like 5 minutes, 10 minutes.
Kasi lang isa.
Okay, probably we can start now. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the seminar of the Social Sciences Division. It is with great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker. He is an agricultural economist and a visiting research fellow of this division. He is also an adjunct professor at the University of the Philippines at Los Baños. So at this juncture, we would like to reiterate to welcome our friends from UTLP. And our speaker is an economist all the way in his career. He completed his bachelor's degree in economics in Miami University. With the excitement of learning other cultures and speaking in Spanish, he learned it during his high school years. He served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Chuquisaca, Bolivia for 2 years. He lived with the Guarani Indians, an indigenous people in Bolivia. The Guarani Indians are often called the Bolivia's death slaves because they live enslaved by death. They are born and they die in debts to the haciendados, the Spanish word for big landowners, which is similar to our hacienda system here in the Philippines. Our speaker saw the hardships of the Guarani Indians and thought that economics can play a big role in helping the poor people like the Guarani Indians. So he pursued an MS and PhD in agricultural economics from Iowa State University and University of California, Davis, respectively. He is a prolific writer that can be seen from his international journal publications. In fact, he is also a member of various editorial boards in international journals, one as an associate editor at the American Association of Agricultural Economics. Our speaker has 3 sons, but his wife often tells her friends that in her family she has 4 boys. And you know already who is the first one. So together with his family, they came to the Philippines last year, and he joined IRRI since I think April in am I right? June 2011, and he's going to present his work to us this afternoon. His talk is about did the commodity price spike increase rural poverty, evidence from Bangladesh. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our towering adopted Guarani Indian and very cool professor, Dr. Joseph Valdez Balagtas.
Thank you very much for such a kind introduction. So I should first say this works collaborative with several IRRI and former IRRI people, and they're all listed here. Bandari and Hossein both located in Bangladesh. Sam and Ellen here working with me. If we put these authors in order of the amount of time and work they spent on it, I think Eleni would be somewhere up here. Sam and Mahbub have been dead weight, right? But they brought us here, and so they have to get some credit. The title I was thinking as I sat here is not a very good one, because anyone who's thought about this at all would write a very short version of this paper titled so and say yes, obviously, duh. And so really what the paper is about is how did the commodity price spike increase rural poverty, right? To what extent did it increase rural poverty? And more generally, what lessons can we learn about income dynamics and poverty from this massive market event? And that massive market event looks like this, right? And you've all seen versions of this chart before. These are Thai export and internal Bangladesh wholesale rice prices in real 2000 US dollars, dating back to the turn of the century, right? As we all know, right, in 2007, 2008, we had this dramatic, rapid increase in prices. Internally in Bangladesh, the magnitude of the price spike wasn't quite as big, but they saw a 75% increase in rice prices, within a matter of a few months. And so the question is, well, what the research questions we want to address are, well, how did this impact rural households in South Asia, right, and in Bangladesh? And this rice, these market events could have two potentially conflicting effects, right? So if you're a rice consumer, higher rice prices make you worse off. If you're a rice producer, right, higher rice prices could potentially be a good thing, either directly because they raise your income, right, or in the sense that your rice production can serve as a hedge against the increase in the price of a major expenditure category. Right? So it sort of protect you from your production, can protect you from this market event. Again, the net effect is an empirical question. So how big is this effect? This is an empirical question. And what sort of household characteristics, what household activities influence the magnitude of that effect on household income and on poverty? And those are the topics of the talk, of the paper. So how did the market events of 2007 and 8 affect rural households in Asia? We'll focus on income and poverty. There's all kinds of ways to measure household well-being. Right? And really, we're going to take a very narrow view of the household's well-being and just look at income and poverty. And we'll do so using a survey that my co-author and former director here, Dr. Hussain, initiated back in the 1980s. And he should receive a lot of credit for this survey, right? He took a very long view of the problems of rural Asia, right? And started collecting data serially on households in Bangladesh, right? So that we could track income over time. So we could track farm activities over time, right? We could track demographics over time, right? And this data is a really rich resource for us to learn about what's going on in the world. So actually what we do really in one sense is to update a paper that Dr. Hussain already had done with a visitor here. It was his grad student, I can't remember her first name, Nargis is her last name. They published a paper in 2006 in agricultural economics. They ran some income regressions to see how various demographics affected income, right? And they measured poverty incidence over time between 1988 and 2004, right? And over that time period, over that 16-year time period, 16? They find poverty is declining dramatically over this time. Bangladesh is doing a lot to help its population sort of climb out of poverty. Dramatic decreases in poverty, right? And they find that farms that are moving out of agriculture, diversifying away from agriculture, are doing better than farms that do not. And that's consistent with a lot of a large strain of this literature that says, we ought to help farmers move out of agriculture, or diversify away from agriculture. So we take a new route, relatively new route of the survey in 2008, and ask, well, are those trends continuing? Right? The trends that we saw for some years up through 2004, we continue to see a decline in poverty, right? And again, what activities, what household characteristics influence whether or not farms continue to come out of poverty? Households, I shouldn't say farms, households continue to come out of poverty. By the way, Dr. Hossein is currently rounding up funding to collect the next round, 2012 round of this data. And so there's a lot of interesting research, I think, that could be done using this next round that will come out in the next year or so. So it's a repeat survey. The data itself is a repeat survey of nationally representative, let's say. Okay. What they do is they take one union in each of 64 districts in Bangladesh. Right? They take one representative village in each union. They take and made a this is 1984. Made a detailed census of that village. Right? And from that detailed census, they randomly selected. They selected households stratified on various household characteristics, right? To yield some kind of representativeness in the same. And, this map here shows sort of the geographic distribution of the surveyed villages in the country. In 1984, they started with about 20 households per village. Okay, so we've got some 1,200 households, right? And over time, in each subsequent wave of the survey, they surveyed the original households plus any offshoots of those households. So by 2004, 2008, the sample's grown from about 1,200 to about 2,000 households. Let me say one word about the policy setting. So this last round of the survey that we look at occurs right when we see these big swings in rice prices, right? So that's going to allow us to sort of measure what's going on with household income and associate that. I'm not going to say we're going to find causal links, but we're going to associate it with this price spike. The reason I say we're not sort of measuring the effect of the price spike is because there's a lot of other stuff going on that we're not measuring. Right? There's other macroeconomic events going on. There's a financial crisis in the U.S. There's a global recession just starting to begin here, and that could affect households, especially those reliant on income from let's say an overseas foreign worker. It could affect the overall business environment, etc. So there's a lot of things happening besides the price rise. Let's just start by looking at some of this data. These are just a few of the variables that we have data on. Farm size has fallen from about 0.6 hectares to about half a hectare, but seems to have stabilized over the last, between 2004 and 2008, at just under half a hectare. Area under tenancy had been growing dramatically, right? Doubled between 1988 and 2004. And in 2008, we see a big drop from 40 to 14%. 14% of the land that's farmed is rented. Right? And what that says, we think, is, right, rice prices are really high all of a sudden. And you're a landowner, right? In order to capture some of those rents, you decide not to rent out land and farm it yourself and try to reap some of this reap a return on these high rice prices. The number of ag workers per household is falling, while the number of laborers per household, either domestic migrants or overseas migrants, is growing. Right? When we first sampled these households, there was 1 in every 5 households had a worker, had a household member working in the city, working in Dhaka, let's say, right? And by 2008, 1 of every 2, half of all the households had a worker in the city in Bangladesh. In 1988, 1 in 100 households had a worker, had a member working overseas. Right? And by 20 years later, 1 in every 5 has a worker, has a family member working overseas. So what we see is less labor allocated to agriculture over time, more labor outside the household, outside the village over time. Right? So moving away from agriculture. If we look at some income measures and assets, we see a similar pattern, right? The percent of income from agriculture here falls from 60% to 40%, approximately. Right? The share of income from rice falls by 10 percentage points to 15%. Meanwhile, remittance income goes from 5% of household income to almost a quarter of household income in 2008. Right? And by 2008, remittances account for more income than rice, and about as much income as all crop production. Crop production by 2008 accounts for 26% of income. Right? Remittances 23%. Right? So income's becoming less and less important, or excuse me, agriculture is becoming less and less important in income. And that's reflected also in physical assets, in capital. Right? Household capital over this time period, physical capital of the household is increased dramatically, but the share of that physical capital that's related to agriculture declines. So households are accumulating physical capital unrelated to agriculture, shifting their assets away from agriculture, human and physical assets away from agriculture. So we see diversification away from agriculture, although agriculture is still important. Right? And the question is, how do these and other demographic shifts affect income? And so one way to answer that is to estimate an income regression. Right? We're going to just regress log income on all these household demographics and the number of laborers you have in overseas and the capital that you have in agriculture and non-agricultural uses and so on. Right? And sort of try to quantify empirically the determinants of income. And here's the result, some selected results from one such regression for 2008. So this is a cross-section study. I just look at the 2008 data, regressing household income on a bunch of household demographics. And here's some important results. An additional additional hectare of land would increase income by about 20%, household income by 20%. If you're a non-farm household, right, your income is lower by 10% than your neighbors that farm. An additional non-agricultural worker increases income dramatically by 16%. Right? Human capital matters, so the smarter or the more skilled your workers, the higher your household income will tend to be. Right? And this is the big one. Having a household member overseas working raises household income by half. Right? Another way to say that is having an additional migrant worker is about equivalent as having 2 more hectares of land. Right? Average farm size here is about half a hectare. It's a huge increase in the land production. And those results are similar for all 4 survey waves, and it's consistent with a large literature on income determinants in rural communities. And there's a corollary policy recommendation that says, look, those households who are moving away from agriculture tend to be doing better in terms of income, so we should help these households, right, accumulate the capital, right, to tap migrant labor markets, to tap entrepreneurial markets. And that's going to help them move out of agriculture, right? It's called a pathway. It's one of the pathways out of poverty. Help these households shift away from agriculture, diversify away from agriculture. There's an important caveat to this work, and that's that kind of a technical one, right? Cross-sectional studies, if I'm just looking at 2008, there are things that I don't see, right? Like skill, right? Or industriousness, right? How hard someone works, that could affect my income and also affect whether I work abroad or not. And so, in econometrics, we'd say that this regression could suffer from endogeneity, the estimates may be biased, etc. We could exploit the panel nature of this data. Remember, we see these some of these households over 20 years, 4 times. And essentially what we could do is give each of those households their own dummy variable, their own intercept. Right? And that intercept is going to control for any unobserved, time-invariant household characteristics. Right? And to the extent that those are the cause of our endogeneity, this household-specific dummy variable, or this fixed effect, right, is going to fix our problem. Right? And so we took a subsample of the data that we observed over 4 survey waves over 20 years. That's about 1,000 households. An estimated fixed effects model, right? Essentially the same regression, except we have a household-specific intercept. Right? These are the results I showed you 2 slides ago from the 2008 cross-section. Here's our fixed effects estimator. All the signs are essentially the same. I think the big difference here is this one. The migrant worker, in addition, when our cross-sectional study said migrant worker would increase income by half. Right? The fixed effects model says it's still a big contributor to income, but not quite as much. Right? So the method changes our inference a little bit. Right? I think there's poverty in the income, in the title, and so we're going to move on and talk about poverty, and of course that's related to income. But before I do, any questions about this? Yeah.
The negative sign on the education of the non-agricultural workers, that would run counter to your first conclusions, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Negative, and at the 10% level, I would say it's 0.
But still, it's a very surprising finding, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's completely contrary to your first set of suggestions.
Completely contrary. That an additional non-ag worker.
The focus on basically helping households to move out of agriculture by providing them education.
Yeah. So this is contradictory, not to my work, right, but to the literature that says let's move out of agriculture. Right? I think we find even stronger evidence later. I'll talk about. But yeah, that's.
One other quick question: your area, when you showed the trend in the area was basically unchanged between 2004 and 2008. But the tendency had changed very much. Is that the operated area or is that the owned area? The half a hectare or so. It's a farm size.
Farm size is
Owned area?
owned area,
So operated area maybe changing a lot more.
possibly. That's a good idea. I should look at the operating. Yep.
I guess you, in your select sample statistic, the range of non-farm household is 34 to 43.
Yeah.
Did you attempt to analyze it separately from
No.
farm household? Because they really behave differently, farm household and non-farm household. Because from your sample, 34 to 42% is quite significant.
Yeah.
And it is possible that even the income determinants and others are different if you separate them. And
What
then
we have
analyze-
here, what we do, we don't analyze, well, in a sense, we analyze them separately, right?
Yeah,
In the same regression, we let the non-farm households have a different intercept,
so,
right? And so we find non-farm households have lower income on average than farm households, right? Yeah, we might pull them out altogether and sort of estimate different income determinants for different
yeah.
types of households. Yeah, that'd be a good suggestion.
Definitely they will have different determinants. Why did you combine them?
Because it's a terrible excuse, but because of the way we started by replicating Hossein's work. So I'm gonna blame Hossein.
Thank you. Nice presentation, actually, but
Farm and non-farm household.
I have some observations about the endogeneity in the model. For
Yeah.
example, you have taken the migrant worker, especially the overseas, especially in Bangladesh, to send a person in abroad for work. You have to spend a lot, and you need kind of network and communication with someone. So I think this is very endogenous, and that's why in the fixed effect model you got very small coefficient, just half of that, 50% to 29%. This one. And second one is rise land in modern varieties. This is also indigenous. I think this thing perfectly determined by the education of the household and several other things. Also some natural calamities. Also, let's say the soil type or the location specific something. By the way, did you include any location specific damage in your model?
No, this does not have.
I think if you include, then you will see a more strange result here. I mean, if you don't use this fixed big model. Yeah, so this is my suggestion is that why don't you run separate integration for those households with migrant worker? And then you will see, actually there are some literature.
So here's the problem, right? So if you estimate different, if you estimate different models for migrant and for workers with migrant, or households with migrant labor and households with without migrant labor, you don't have a nested test for the effects of migrant labor.
I mean, that's why, I mean, this qualify for instrumental variable model. And if you don't go for this one, then why don't you go for some reduced form equation? I mean, just take some
So see the
purely
determinants of
exogenous
migrant-
variables, yeah.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to know what the determinants of is it wealth? Determinants of migrant workers? Right. Or with the panel data, you could use maybe lag variables.
But you might include some.
That's a good suggestion.
Yeah, let's say, I mean, the distance between Dhaka to specific district. Also, there are bus fare you can take also. That is variables are available in the internet. You can take also. You don't have to
Will you please continue? I need you to.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll turn our attention to poverty. To analyze poverty, we need to measure poverty, right? And here's the measure that we use, and it's a standard in the literature. It's Foster's measure of poverty, right? Where Y here is Y is household income, and Z is some poverty threshold. Right? And we could give alpha up here, this power, different values, 0, 1, or 2, right? And that'll give us different measures of poverty. If alpha is 0, right, then this is just a poverty head count. P0 here would be the share of our sample that's below Z, the poverty threshold. Okay. The other two measures kind of give you a measure of how far below or how deep poverty is among those those households below the poverty threshold. This measure is not without problems. Let me talk about how we calculate this threshold. Right? First, we just take the FAO's concept of moderate poverty. That's 2,100 kilocalories per day per person, right? Plus an additional 30% of that of that expenditure on those kilocalories per person as non-food expenditure. So it's additive here, or it's proportional. And we use local prices, right, to estimate sort of this threshold poverty level. And we could track that in each of the 4 years of the survey. And the problem with this is it assumes that consumers eat X kilos of rice per year, right? And they don't respond to prices. And that's probably an okay approximation for a staple good like rice. Right? And if price increases are broad-based, so prices of all foods are rising, right? It's problematic if you see a lot of substitution. If consumers see an increase in the price of rice and shift to bread, right, or flour. Right? And we discussed that in the paper a little bit, but for now we'll just move on, noting that there's this potential issue. So here are measures of poverty, these last 3 rows. Here's the poverty head count in the middle, through 2004. And what we see is, as I said earlier, we see a big decline in rural poverty in Bangladesh, 62% in 1988 to 44% in 2004. Depth of poverty is also declining over this period. And the reason is, what do we see? The per capita income's rising, right? But this poverty line is more or less stable at 8%. At 8,000 taka per person, right? 2004. We update again. So this data is from Nargis and Hussein. We update it and find that incomes rose from between 2004 and 2008. But the poverty line also rose, right? So now you have to spend more on rice, you have to spend more on fuel, etc. Right? And so the poverty line rose by some 30%, from 8 to 12%. 8 to 12,000 taka per person. Right? And so we see, despite rising income, we see an increase in the poverty head count, increase in depth of poverty. Right? And this isn't really all that surprising, but it's worth noting that, in fact, there's a dramatic increase in poverty associated with this commodity price. That 12 percentage point increase in poverty incidence from 44 to 56% of the sample, right, equates to about 13 more additional people in rural Bangladesh in poverty. Right? So this is a big effect. This is a big issue. And for reasons I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to say this is 13 million people in poverty because of the commodity price spike, but there's suggestive evidence that this is strongly related to higher rice prices. So this raises some additional questions. How, in fact, do these macroeconomic events affect poverty? Right? Is it increasing chronic poverty, making it harder for the poor to climb out of poverty? Right? Is it increasing transitional poverty, pushing households that were not poor below the poverty line? Are there household characteristics or activities that affect the impact of of the commodity price spike or other macroeconomic events on income and poverty? So we, again, turn to our panel data, the 1,000 households or so that we observe in all 4 survey years, to try to answer some of these questions. We start just by putting together some poverty mobility matrices, and I explain them in detail a little bit in the paper, but basically it measures poverty mobility between 2 years, right? Let's count the people who are poor in 1 year and the people who are not poor in that year, or excuse me, households that are poor and households that are not poor in a given year, right? And then when we see them again in 4 years, let's track every individual household. Did this poor household move out of poverty, or was it still poor 4 years later, right? And of these non-poor households, were they still poor? Were they still non-poor in 4 years later, or had they fallen into poverty, right? So we have 4 categories for every household in the sample, right? The poor that stay poor or move out of poverty, and the non-poor that either fall back into poverty or remain non-poor. And here's a very hard to read table. I'm not sure how to make this a little clearer, but let me sort of point out some key numbers here, right? In 2000, there were 446 of our 1,000 households that were poor, right? By 2004, 270 or 60% of those households remained poor. And so that kind of says something about chronic poverty. 60% of the poor in 2000 were still poor in 2004. Okay, 40% of these 446 households had climbed out of poverty. Okay? Of the non-poor in 2000, there are 518 households that were not poor in 2000. Right? 25% of them fell back into poverty. Right? And 75% remained non-poor. And overall, we have a net reduction in poverty from 446 households in 2000 to 397 households in 2004. Okay. That's what we see before the price spike. Now we're going to look at 2004 to 2008 and sort of say, well, what happened over this time that we observed the price spike, right? Now, of the 397 poor households in 2004, 64% of those households remained poor. Okay. Between 2000 and 2004, 60% of poor households remained poor. So there's a small increase in the incidence of chronic poverty, if we can call it that, right? During the time of the price spike. There's also an increase in the rate at which non-poor households fall back into poverty. So in 2004, 567 non-poor households. Of those, 32% fall back into poverty. And we have a net increase in poverty from 397 households to 438%. 438 households. A 7 percentage point increase, 28% increase in transitional poverty. That's the non-poor households that are sliding into poverty. So we have less upward mobility of poverty, less upward mobility in income, right? More chronic poverty, and we have more transitional poverty. Right? Commodity price spike and other macro events maybe are pulling non-poor households into poverty. And so that raises yet more questions, right? And I don't show it here, but there's some tables in the paper that say, in fact, the chronic poor are a little bit different than the rest of the population. They're more reliant on agriculture. And that raises the question, did the chronic poor's reliance on agriculture, or in general, does reliance on agriculture reduce their households' ability to escape poverty? After all, this is the result this is the policy conclusion of this previous research, right, of Hossain's paper, but also this large strain in the literature that says we ought to help people diversify away from poverty. Right? And to get at that answer, or at this question, we estimate a probit model of poverty where we say the probability of being poor in any time period, let's say 2008, is a function of whether or not you're poor in the previous time period, 2004, whether or not you farm in the previous period, and a bunch of other household characteristics in the previous period. So let's look at this, the results from this probit regression for our 2 years. Here's 2004. These are marginal effects, right? So this says being poor in the year 2000 increases the probability that you'll be poor in 2004 by 20%. This is this chronic poverty number. If you're poor in 2000, there's a additional 20% chance that you'll be poor in 2004. Right? If you farm in 2000, there's an additional 20% chance that you're going to be poor in 2004. Consistent with Hossein's work and this other literature that says farming makes you poor. Right? Farming makes you poor. Got to move away from agriculture. If you own land, right, that reduces the probability. If you own land in 2000, that reduces the probability that you'll be poor in 2004. Let's see. If you have a non-farm, if you're a non-farm household, you're slightly less likely to be poor. I think that's a sign error. And if you're a tenant farmer, you're very much likely to be poor. Right, in 2004. Yeah. Dave.
And if you're an overseas migrant, you're also
Slightly likely to be poor here.
surprising.
So let's look at this. So this is what we find in 2004 before this world of crazy commodity prices. Right. So let's look what happens in 2008. Right. In 2008, right, farming suddenly makes you less likely to be poor. Right. If you farmed in 2004, you're 14% less likely to be poor in 2008. Right. If you're an overseas migrant, if you have an overseas migrant worker, you're very much less likely to be poor in 2008. So migrant labor reduces your susceptibility to poverty, right? But in 2008 anyway, so does farming. Being a tenant in 2008, right, is bad news. Right, and why is this? Well, again, what we saw with tenancy rates really dropped 14%. Right, so suddenly commodity prices are high. You're a tenant farmer, and you're thinking, yeah, I'm gonna grow rice and make money. But suddenly the landowner says, no, I'm not going to give you my land. Right, so that if you're a tenant farmer, this commodity price spike was really sort of bad news for you. If you're a landowning farmer, right? Well, you're in good shape. So, let me summarize here. We have a rice price spike and a global recession that reverses the long-run trend out of poverty in rural Bangladesh. We find more chronic poverty and more transitional poverty during this sort of tumultuous macroeconomic time. Chronic poor are more reliant on agriculture. And increasingly so, and non-farm households and land renters tend to be more poor than their counterparts. Moreover, it looks like ag income and land ownership shielded households from the recession, shielded households from the commodity price spike. So not only do you have higher income if you've got marketable surplus, but if you're a consumer of rice and a farmer, right, that production hedges against your consumption risk, price risk in consumption. And again, this works better if you're a landowner than if you're a renter. And one of the key things that we try to draw in the paper is that, as often is the case, the economists up through 2004 were a little bit too confident in their policy prescription. Right? And the policy prescription that they made, let's help diversify people out of agriculture, made sense over the long period of history, long period of the 20th century, that we saw declining real prices of farm commodities. Right? Declining real prices of farm commodities, you want to get out of that business and into something else. Right? But we're no longer in a world of declining real prices of farm commodities, at least not right now. And so why would we, so that policy prescription no longer really holds, at least right now. And so another way to say that is policy or income determinants and poverty determinants, that the policy prescription that flows from those are not time invariant. And so we ought to be really cautious, right, when we're making policy that's dependent on forecasts of rice prices that are really uncertain. And I think that's my time.
Okay, thank you so much.
There's a question that's puzzling me. Ever since I heard the Japanese scholar saying that we should go non-farm income. But regardless of whatever happens in the economy, people continue to grow rice. And the area harvested is increasing, not very much, but still a little bit increasing. So although the percent of household income that comes from rice is declining, the importance of rice has not diminished. Now, how do farmers adjust to these circumstances? Do they, there are more non-farm workers in the household. How do they manage the farm? What things do they use? It has been puzzling me. How do they get along? Because our rice production is increasing. It is not decreasing. So, how would you explain that? It's been very puzzling to me because I'm doing a review of newspaper reports on the rice crisis. And, we keep increasing rice production. Despite the floods, the typhoons, we somehow managed to. But the percent of the household income that comes from rice is going down. But the importance of rice remains. So how do we manage that? We don't have any studies to show that farmers are abandoning the rice farm. There has been conversions, but we still have a slight increase in harvested area. So,
in total harvested area.
yeah.
But I think there has in fact been measurable diversification at the household level away, on average, right, away from rice production. It's a very interesting.
Away from rice, but the total rice produced is still going up. So how do we explain that? I can't explain it. We don't have the data about this. That will be your next project.
It might take a while. Eh?
Although probably quite somewhat relevant in our work here in the Philippines, because we're looking at the psychology of the Filipino rice farmers. So we asked them on their aspirations to their children, because there's a claim that Filipino farmers don't want their children to be a farmer.
Yes.
Yes. But a number of farmers answered, I don't know the proportion yet, but answered that they still want their children to be a farmer. Why? Because they want to ensure that their children have food to eat.
Food to eat. That's very important. Having food to eat overcomes the other obstacles. I don't know, but we need studies on this.
I have a small question. I think. So if you see your adjustment, table 3, we will find household income increased 45% almost. And in table 6, measurement of rural poverty in Bangladesh, and if we consider the expenditure on per household, so the head count ratio tells us the income increases 43%. Expenditure increases 43%. So, and you are showing us that the poverty level has increased. And another issue is agricultural credit increased 128%, and non-agricultural capital increased 178%. So how can we adjust this issue that poverty increases, but these things also increases?
Yeah,
And another issue is with this, we did not see any expenditure figure here in the table. So if it is there, then it would be easy to get the idea, I think so.
Yeah, there's no expenditure figure, right? I didn't make clear. So yeah, indeed, income's rising over between 2004 and 2008, right? And we see poverty increasing because the price of this food basket, the poverty threshold is rising as well, and by more.
Okay. Yes, David.
I wondered, this goes a little bit beyond the remit of the presentation, but just in terms of the data, I think it's an associated issue. I think it would be very interesting to know, what the changes in terms of what the supply response was for the market-oriented versus the self-consuming households. The consumption response also by household type in terms of those who are self-consuming their own production versus those who are market-oriented sellers versus those who are non-farm households, to see what the consumption response to the price spike is, and also if there's a change in terms of the market orientation in response to the price shock. Have you looked at any of these factors? Because I think
Yeah, the consumption data, I don't think Eleni might be able to answer this better. Wake up. I think the consumption data is not there. Production data is, and the answer is I haven't looked carefully at supply response.
Because I think it is interesting with these micro data to see among the groups the difference in response. When they used national level data, for the IGRM and for some of the other trade models, the elasticity, own price elasticity of demand is almost zero. I'm a little bit skeptical about that, so it'd be interesting to see how it differs among the groups because there's so much self-consumption. And the question is the self-consumer basically just shielded from the price effect so that their behavior is unchanged, or do they somehow respond to the price effect even if they're self-consuming? And how should that be treated in terms of looking at the demand and supply response?
Yeah, the again, in this data set, I don't think you could get at the consumption questions. But I think your production questions those are great ideas for you to work on.
Yes, Kate.
Yeah, thank you very much for interesting, sharing your interesting results. I have two questions or comments. One is the poverty increase in 2008. I'm personally interested in also the income distribution effect because poverty can change can change with worsening income distribution or improving income distribution in general. But this case, the impact is the price increase of the rice. So net buyer basically is beneficiary. So the net seller, and so the richer, the large farmer benefit, and the net buyer or the marginal farmer suffer. So I guess income distribution is worse. So the poverty increase, income distribution is worse. That could be the scenario. So in that sense, I would like to see how income distribution also change, give a comprehensive picture of the impact of the price.
Yeah, and that I think relatively, I mean, you could just draw the empirical distributions of income.
Oh, yeah. It just show the Gini coefficient.
Yeah, that's actually good.
And the second question is about the implication about non-agriculture, non-farm activity. It could be still have some contribution in poverty alleviation because if you look at the poor who suffered price hike, those food could compensate their income loss in agriculture by by increasing non-agriculture income. They would have suffered less than those who could not compensate their income from non-agriculture. So this kind of story.
That's right. And I think it's the question I'm asking, right? If you knew that the price was going to of rice was going to rise, right? How would you adjust your assets and your economic activity? It's very different than the one sort of going forward in an uncertain world. You know, how would you adjust, what kind of portfolio of activities would you have, right? And in that sense, I think going forward in an uncertain world, the income diversification just makes sense, right? And it just so happens, ex post, looking backwards, in this particular instance, moving away from agriculture burned you.
Yeah, because it's kind of windfall gain for the net seller. So.
Yeah.
Okay, some more questions? If not, okay.
My
One
question
last.
is maybe just clarificatory. Maybe I didn't catch it the few percentages. Could we go to the table on the poverty one? I was just not sure how it was. Yeah, that too. How are we looking at land owned and tenant? Are they exclusive from each other? Like if a household is land owned, or if a household's farm is land owned, does it mean that the household is not considered a tenant?
I'm sorry. This is this variable is the quantity of land owned.
Okay. It's the area.
It's the area.
And tenant is a stat.
And this is a discrete 0-1 indicator.
Thank you.
Okay. So everyone, please join me in thanking Joseph.